Hello, welcome to our diversity research presentation by myself, Paul Hameister, David Hill, Sana Iftikhar, Chelsea McNarry, and Molly McKnight. We've decided to look at the loss of culture and cultural identity among different groups. The reason we chose this topic is because of how identity can affect a person and how a community identity and culture can directly correlate to how someone identifies. We focus on four main cultural demographics for this study: Indigenous Americans, Muslims, African immigrants and refugees, and second generation immigrants. The main takeaway for this presentation is to raise awareness for things that may be happening in people that have lost their culture and possible help in reintroducing this culture back into certain communities. Additionally, we want to advocate for these people against racist or otherwise prejudiced or discriminatory behavior. We also wanted to bring awareness to the issue to reduce the rate of self-harm and suicide.
Cognitive behavioral therapy is an application that can be used to address this issue. Specifically, it can address the anxiety and depression that comes with culture loss. The technique may benefit from addressing issues specific to the culture of the client. As highlighted by Graham, Sorensen, and Hayes Skelton in their 2013 paper, having direct conversations about marginalized status, discrimination, and microaggressions early in the therapy may increase the success of treatment. The treatment also has the benefit of generally only requiring a dozen sessions or so. Family systems therapy is another approach that may be used. It may help the client understand how their family and their family's culture is affecting the issues they are encountering as they feel a loss of culture. It may also help them discover some of their culture by bringing the family into the therapy and help them better understand how their culture and traditions may drive the way their parents treat them. Although early therapists may have shied away from non-Western indigenous healing methods, many clients have found that including traditional methods can be helpful with their therapy. This is especially true with culture and identity loss. Connecting with traditional methods may help the client reconnect with the lost culture they are missing in their lives. This can, however, be difficult if indigenous healers from their culture are not available in the local area.
There are several necessary proactive or alternative steps that counselors can take when working with a minority who is experiencing a loss of identity or culture. The first would be integrating culturally sensitive healing practices into the counseling sessions. I'll dive into it deeper in the presentation, but for example, for Indigenous Americans, some Indigenous Americans are interested in using the healing practices that are affiliated with their tribe to help move them through the healing process and make them feel more connected to their culture and to their tribe. The second is to consult. You can never have enough consultation with supervisors who have extensive experience in working with the population that you are working with. It's really important to have an ethical practice and seek consultation when it is required. Third, you can leverage evidence-based practice in conjunction with building a network of community resources. So even as you are using theories and applying research-based treatments that are tailored to the specific minority and population that you are working with, it's also important that you have community resources to lean back on when you may need to refer them to, let's say, a spiritual leader or somebody who is also going to help the healing process in conjunction with what is happening in the therapy room.
Some of the reasons that Indigenous Americans have lost a sense of culture is due to, at first, the European colonists decimating the indigenous population to around 10% of its original population when they colonized the area. Secondly, indigenous people are severely underrepresented in TV and movies and other forms of media, making them seem invisible. As well as in the 1830s, many of the indigenous Americans were forced to move to Oklahoma, away from wherever they did come from originally. One other thing that has happened is children had been removed from families and placed into English-speaking boarding schools and were punished for speaking in their native language. Finally, up until 1978, with the Indian Child Welfare Act, children could be removed from family and would be placed into English-speaking households. It was said that over 90% of Indigenous children were placed into these non-Indigenous homes.
One form of resistance a counselor may face when working with Indigenous Americans is that when compared to whites, Indigenous Americans are more likely to believe that therapy is a waste of money, and they are also less likely to believe that it would help improve coping of any type. And the second form of resistance is that when compared to whites, Indigenous Americans are more likely to believe that a higher percentage of people with mental health challenges would get better without professional help. And White breaks this down a little bit more. And it's really important that if you happen to be a non-Native person, that you understand the historical context of the Indigenous populations in North America. They've had a history of a lot of oppression, of a lot of people that have come and gone. They try to help, but not really. And it's resulted in like the natives being kind of thrown under the rug, that people don't really have, like the general feeling that people don't really have their best interests at heart. And one way to resolve this issue as a counselor is to use humility when working with them. So non-Native counselors, they need to have a self-awareness and criticality to really comprehend the client's worldview and history, and also how they operate within their family and cultural system. And also understand the historical privilege and marginalization that this population has faced over time. There are several counseling implications that as future counselors we must be aware of when working with Indigenous Americans. The first is in a school counseling setting. So racism is a large influence on the mental health outcomes of Indigenous Americans. For example, there are stereotype portrayals of Indigenous Americans that often exist as sport team logos or names. One example is the Redskins. And Sue et al. Indicates that high school students who are Indigenous Americans that view these images have increased rates of depression, lower self-esteem, and a decreased perception of community worth. This example also reminds me of a case study that I sat in on in a counseling consultation group. So the client that they were discussing was an Indigenous American, and he was rushing a fraternity. In order to be a bro, he essentially had to put up with a lot of racist language and jokes surrounding his cultural and racial background. It made him feel really depressed and sad, but he also really wanted to fit in with this group. The second setting is in family counseling. Since many Indigenous Americans prioritize family and community belonging, family counseling and even social work is a good fit for this demographic. Indigenous American families and communities also often have shared experiences of historical trauma through oppression and colonization, so leveraging a family or even a community systems approach could really help with increasing the resilience of everyone in the system. The third setting is mental health counseling. Ye et al. Indicated that research regarding connecting ethnic minorities with mental health counseling services primarily emphasizes the importance of finding an appropriate match between the client and counselor, and they find the match based on race, ethnicity, and multicultural competence. So even though this research is super duper important for increasing the quality of Western counseling services for ethnic minorities, it may still not be sufficient enough to meet the needs of all minority populations. Some minorities may prefer their culture's form of Indigenous healing methods, and this is really important to keep in mind when you are working with Indigenous Americans, because you may have to, as a counselor, be aware of the Indigenous healing methods that are significant for their clients. And it's really important that if you're working with a specific tribe, that you are aware of the healing methods for the specific tribe that your client is affiliated with. The healing methods can change between different tribes and amongst different tribes, so you don't really want to generalize what healing methods could be significant for your client. You may also want to take a hybrid approach where you are open to collaborating with an Indigenous healer if that's what your client wants. So potentially they could go to counseling with you in your space, and then they could also work with an Indigenous healer outside of the counseling session. And another approach would be kind of combining the two, where you incorporate Indigenous healing methods directly into your counseling practice.
Finally, we have some implications, strengths, and potential barriers that may come for counseling. Sometimes there's a strength that does correlate with a potential barrier. For instance, there's a strong sense of community and relationships within these tribal communities. However, because of that, there's also a lot of broken treaties and mistrust that make Indigenous people suspicious of motives and of the majority of American culture. There's a very high affinity for spirituality, and also non-interference is important to their culture because they want to respect the rights of others. However, because of this, peers often do not address or even support substance abuse, making it more of a community-based problem than an individual problem. Also, with a very high affinity for spirituality, many Indigenous people believe that mental health issues come from unbalanced spiritual relationships rather than a trauma that may have come from earlier time in their life. Additionally, they have very strong familial relationships. Children are often raised in multiple households by extended family. But with that comes the fear of familial alienation that they might come from talking about mental health problems. Another potential barrier is that poverty is often very strong in some of these communities, and because of that, some of the basic needs are not met. That leads to the thought that basic needs must be met prior to mental health concerns being even addressed.
Hey, my name is Sana, and I'm going to be talking about the identification of loss of culture in American Muslims. Muslim immigrants are those who were born in another country and immigrated to the US or are the children of Muslim immigrants. And the population of Muslims in America estimate the total number of anywhere between 2 million to 7 million people. Unfortunately, there has been significant discrimination and racial profiling against Muslim immigrants since September 11th, 2001. The media's negative portrayal of Muslims and Islam has only contributed to racial discrimination. Muslims now fear that any display of religious enthusiasm could indicate potential terrorism, since the media has given them a new face for concealed quote-unquote terrorists. Other problems include communication difficulties, accents, clothing preferences, skin tone, and overall physical appearance. Islam is practiced by Muslims in a wide variety of ways, as is true for other religions as well. Sudden disconnection from family members and the fear of being forced to practice Western traditions can cause grief and sadness within the Muslim community. Muslims feel denied the right to follow certain Muslim cultural and religious practices, and that can include wearing a hijab, which is a head covering to cover your hair, and praying 5 times a day. And the Muslim community may display some resistance in seeking treatment. So the Muslim community may resist behavioral changes, and recommendations might not be taken positively by the group overall. These groups have felt like outcasts and are struggling with racial differences in the dominant American community. So in this case, a counselor must understand the cultural diversity while intervening with multiracial groups like Muslims. Understanding the culture's family life and social issues, for example, can be an effective tool for changing attitudes and behaviors towards a Western culture. Belief based on religion can limit participants from taking treatment. Emotional resistance by the individual on the ground belief of being treated by counselors from other race, a defensive mindset for feelings of guilt, anger, and helplessness blocks exploring the self. Muslim immigrants may doubt the counselor's intentions sometimes, believing that mental health counselors from other countries in the U.S. are unable to understand the religion and the cultural context. So due to this, they may feel led in the wrong direction or encouraged to take actions contrary to their values and their belief system. And this can influence their attitude towards mental health treatment. The result is an increase in the prevalence of unmet mental health needs and an increase of social isolation. Activism and advocacy for Muslim communities is very, very important. Counselors not only act as advocates for clients, connecting them to resources and services they otherwise would not have access to, but they also teach them how to stand up for themselves in the face of social injustices or lack of access to community resources and services. Some implications could include school counseling, and it leads to openness in culture. So students can learn about other cultures in addition to observing bullying and stigmatization of American Muslim students at school. Family counseling, as it assists clients in developing trust in therapy and cognitive intervention models. Clinical mental health counseling, it eliminates preconceived notions of fear and detachment from seeking help from healthcare professionals. And lastly, family counseling with more Muslim population can bridge the gap and knowledge among the counselors about the taboos and social norms of the Muslims. Although conventional family, school, and mental health counseling may be effective, counselors should gain a deeper understanding of the existing Muslim culture. Mental health counseling may be interpreted negatively by Muslims as being labeled quote-unquote insane. It can also be viewed as a curse from God for some. Therefore, counselors should assess their cultural competence in counseling Muslims and train accordingly. The Muslim immigrant community has a diverse set of languages, culture, traditions, and religious beliefs. As a growing minority group, it is imperative that mental health services are culturally sensitive to avoid further isolation and marginalizations within the group.
The next demographic we will look at is African immigrants and refugees. They come from a variety of cultures, religions, and countries. They come to America for a variety of reasons, and often feel a loss of culture and community as they do. Some resistance to treatment may result from untreated trauma as a result of the immigration, spending time in a refugee camp with poor conditions, or the conditions that were occurring in their country leading to their migration to the United States. This trauma may need to be addressed before any further treatment can be applied. As a result of relocation in the United States, it may be difficult for the client to feel comfortable with a counselor from a different culture, religion, or that speaks a different language. Because of the very diverse languages and cultures of Africa, it may be difficult to find a community with helping professionals that African clients will feel comfortable interacting with. Some ways to advocate for this community include connecting them with indigenous healers that reflect their culture. Also connecting them with spiritual leaders and communities that match their own cultural background and religion. The last thing mentioned here is that you can work with NGOs and government agencies that specifically work for the relocation of refugees. Doing so can make their transition into the country easier and help get them in touch with communities that will help them continue to feel connected to their culture and their identity. Implications include counselors understanding how diverse Africa is. Treating their clients from different cultures, religions, and backgrounds the same simply because they are from Africa will not be helpful to the clients. Counselors need to understand that Western counseling methods may not be helpful to clients without modifying them for their specific culture. Intake forms for clients should allow them to explain their culture, religion, language, and their journey to America.
With many second-generation immigrants, there is an increased shame around mental health care. Those who would otherwise seek out mental health care may not due to the shame that their parents have associated with having a mental illness. Mental illnesses are believed to either not exist or to negatively impact their children's chances of success. According to studies, Asian Americans are the least likely to seek out mental health services, and that is partly because of the negative associations around mental health care and the lack of belief that mental health problems are real problems. Some ways that we can increase the chances of meeting our desired outcomes with the second-generation immigrant population would be increasing online accessibility to mental health services and self-help platforms. This will allow those who aren't able to meet therapists in person to still have access to some help, as well as having an increased chance of working with individuals of similar backgrounds to them. Another method would be organizing community engagement activities to help increase feelings of community identity. This will allow for second-generation immigrants to connect with other individuals of a similar background, as well as having activities outside of the home to build community connections. Finally, encouraging social movement groups that promote intersectionality. Those who are second-generation immigrants often have problems with identity and feeling connected to the various parts of themselves, and being parts of groups that recognize the entire person versus parts of a person will allow for individuals to feel more accepting of not only themselves, but of their community. Within school settings, counselors need to be aware of as many aspects of the school as possible. Teachers and other staff with a lack of multicultural training may negatively impact a student's ability to learn and may create problems for the students in other areas, such as if a teacher makes an assumption about a student based on their race or where they are from, even if it is not true for that student and that student's family. With clinical mental health counseling, an entire family may be involved in the counseling process, even if the focus is just on the individual being counseled. This may be because of the way the family is being run in a matriarchal or patriarchal way, or the family being part of the client's healing process, and thus the importance of being involved as the client works on healing and works on learning more about themselves and both sides of their culture. In family counseling, the two dominant cultures need to be recognized. In many homes, there may be another language spoken at home other than English, and then English primarily spoken outside of the home. Both parts of the family's identity need to be recognized and considered as important.
Thank you for watching our presentation. Here are the references that we used while creating it.